Thanks, Keith, and thanks everyone for the invitation and for taking the time to come and hear what I have to say. I think I got this gig because I gave a talk to the Academy of Science and Technologists a few months ago. And John Kierkegaard told me that people in this room are pretty sharp, so I've added a few slides to make it more complex than the Academy. Now, I'm going to be talking about a range of things. It's not just new technologies and new things that perhaps will come into practice. I'm going to be talking about trends that are going to influence agriculture and maybe try and stimulate a bit of thinking around whether, in fact, Australian grains production is, in fact, accommodating those trends. I'm going to talk a little bit about digital agriculture, new genetics, some new other interventions, and then hopefully, if there's time, some analysis that we've been doing about land use choices in a future world adapting to climate change. Okay, so first of all, the megatrends influencing agriculture and food. This is a study that was undertaken by GRDC with two CSIRO staff here. I'll run through this pretty quickly. I think you're all fairly familiar with it. Basically, these are 5 areas that we think are going to influence Australian agriculture. First of all, basically, we need to produce more food from less because of growing population pressure. I think everybody's familiar with that. But the land area available for that is not increasing. And also constraints on inputs are going to drive more efficiency. We're sitting next to a part of the world which is basically increasing in wealth. In China, Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, growing middle class. And as people become more middle class, they want to diversify their diet, they eat more protein. And are we actually positioning ourselves to accommodate that? And also, as people become wealthier, they become choosier. They want to have food as a with health attributes. They want to know how their food was produced. Where was it produced? How was it produced? Was it produced ethically? And also, above all, they want it to be safe. So these are actually big opportunities for Australian agriculture, but we're actually addressing those opportunities in a world which is actually increasingly more volatile, both from a climate perspective, but also social perspective and political perspective. And I think we've seen some examples of that in the last couple of weeks, a lot of unpredictability in the system. And as a scientist, and as scientists in general, there's been rapid changes in technology which we believe are opening doors that will help us meet some of these opportunities while also trying to ride some of this volatility. So just to illustrate this kind of growth of opportunity, this is just a chart of food imports into China. The red line are imports, blue line are exports, and this is the balance of trade. This is just a growing and major opportunity for this country. However, I think we're all aware that agricultural productivity in Australia, first of all, it's subject to a lot of variation because of climate, but also there are trends of slowing down of productivity. So the challenge is actually quite strong. And why is that so? I think the climate that we're farming, and I don't really need to tell you this, you'd know this yourselves, is changing. This is basically rainfall patterns, deviation from the long-term average in the inner wheat belt in southwest Australia. You can see here the last 20, 30 years, very, very different rainfall patterns to what's historically been the case. It's really a classic example of sustained climate change in that environment. And I'd like to draw your attention to a recent publication from January, actually, this last month, in the online journal The Conversation, which I think anyone can access. It's free. It's a paper by Zvi Hopman and his team. They've actually been looking at the yield potential for wheat in Australia over the last several decades. And they've shown that over the last 20 years, there's been a rapid decline in wheat yield potential. I.e. what you could actually potentially produce in those environments. But we haven't observed that decline in productivity, and that's because commensurate with this, there's been efforts to address the yield gap. So improved management systems, improved genetics, which are helping close the gap between what the potential is and what can be achieved. But ultimately, in order to actually expand what we can produce, the potential needs to be increased as well. So I'd recommend that article to people. It's an easy read. Coming back to the megatrends, these are some of the issues around middle-class consumers in Asia. Some of the drivers around convenience, indulgence, ethics, health is big, and food safety has to be there. So particularly in food products, meat and livestock, probably less of an issue in grains unless we have a real problem. So how important is health as a driver? So there's lots of survey information around this at the moment. So this basically is a survey where they address the question, I believe food is effective as a medicine in maintaining one's overall health. And there's a trend from when this was run in 2012 to 2016 with an increase in awareness of people seeking health. And it doesn't matter what type of consumer you are or what country you're in. But when you ask people whether they'll pay for that, what we actually find in this survey here in developed countries is that it's actually only Generation Z and the millennials, so very young people, that are prepared to pay, significantly prepared to pay for higher prices for health attributes. And cynically, some people have told me that's because they don't yet have mortgages. But nonetheless, I think the overall trend is that we are going to see whereby the genetics that we basically create for new grain varieties is going to have built-in health attributes. There's going to have to be management that brings those to bear, and value adding either through processing or substantiation or some kind of communication to consumers about health attributes of products that's going to open up some of those markets. Are we ready for that? I don't know, and I'd be interested in people's comments on that. So now I'll get round to some of the technological trends. I think we're all aware of the influence of digital technology basically in modern society. If you're still going to the travel agent to book an airline ticket, then it probably hasn't caught up with you. But effectively, it changes almost every part of our lives in the finance sector, the retail sector, the travel sector, etc. And it's going to have a big impact on agriculture. It's mainly about data, and what we're actually observing is a change in the way we solve problems. So this basically is the way traditionally we solve problems. We identify the problem, make a hypothesis if we're scientists about it, go and seek specific data about that problem, discover something about that problem and apply it. But the paradigm's changed because data is now incredibly cheap to access and obtain. So now it's actually easier, rather than seeking data around a particular problem, just to get data about everything and the whole system. And then you can analyse that whole system to look for patterns that will actually identify hypotheses that you couldn't identify, that you perhaps weren't aware of originally, and also solutions to problems that you weren't able to identify initially. And you see examples of this, and some of them are a little bit unfortunate in the health sector at the moment, but you see examples of this all over society, and it's happening in basically the applications of genomics in breeding, precision ag, fintech in agriculture. Banks are using this sort of problem solving. So it's all about data and how we actually capture and analyse data. Capturing data these days is because sensor technology has been very, very highly refined. This is just an example from some work in CSIRO about the ecology of bees, where sensors now are so small you can actually apply them to individual insects, and you can use those sensors to monitor the behaviour of bees in field situations. I'm not saying that this is what we're going to do, put sensors on all bees, just to illustrate just how incredibly adaptable this technology has become. So in digital agriculture, I'll just run around this. Basically, sensor technology, be they sensors on the farming machinery, be they fixed sensors, for example, for soil measurements, be they drones flying over fields, has come a long way and is providing massive amounts of information. Remote sensing, say from satellites or high-altitude aircraft. The new satellites that are released have now cloud-penetrating imaging technology, so they're actually much more useful than they have been in the past. They collect the data. Data analytics, analysing that data using artificial intelligence and machine learning, so built-in systems to learn about what you're doing in the machinery that's doing the analysis. And of course, clouds, networks, which is a big issue in Australia. Can you get connectivity? Can you get connections to clouds to manage the data? And can you actually get connection for the Internet of Things to manage machinery in remote rural regions? So if you go through what we traditionally use, so statistical, process and statistical modelling, systems like AppSim, you can fuse all this to actually get the best of your model and the best of the real-time data, make decisions, and then ultimately in the future, more and more robotics built into farming machinery and automation to actually implement those decisions. And out here, once you get out into the supply chain and value chain, digital technology is enabling basically steps in that value chain and information flow through that value chain. So this is leading to the growth of a large number of companies that are looking to supply into this area. And this is just some examples basically from Australia and some from the US of some well-known companies that are wrestling, shall we say, for this market. Probably the best known one is Climate Corporation, which was bought out by Monsanto and has an alliance with John Deere, and in the US has access to data that is collected from farming practices by John Deere machinery and then provides information back. And they're claiming increases in profitability of 5 to 10% on the farms that are their clients. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what the PR from that company is actually claiming. There are some in Australia, NFF and Accenture have developed a digital agricultural service for the cotton industry, and grain growers and PA Source are getting together also to provide similar systems. I'd just like to make a comment about Yield Profit, which is commercialised through Birchip Cropping Group, way ahead of its time, because what actually Yield Profit does is actually what some of these other newer companies are providing to do. So I think Australia had was ahead of its time at that point. Everything about digital ag has growth trends to it. So, for example, the numbers of patents that can be assigned to the digital agriculture space is increasing every year, and most market projections, obviously for investor portfolios, are showing nice upward curves. So we were intrigued about, in CSIRO, what could we do that actually might test some of this in the real world with a real Australian industry client. And we ran this event last year at Catalyst last December, and we were fortunate enough in that event to partner with Lawson Grains, one of Australia's larger grain farming enterprises, who have collected now for several years precision agriculture data on their farm. And we ran what's known as a hackathon, which basically gives teams of data scientists access to their data for 3 months. And then they went into a competition. There was a reasonable prize for the competition, and they could actually they would present what they'd actually found from that data and what they thought they could provide as new information for better management on those farms for Lawson Grains. It's an illustration of people being more open about their data, because at the end, this is data about Lawson Grains farms. It's not much use to anybody else unless you actually have the farm. But a lot of people are concerned about privacy of data. But I think here, the beneficiary is by making it open for this competition. And we had some steamy sort of panel sessions at this meeting, and it was great fun. But I thought I'd go on. So the sort of data you get from Lawson's Grains, a whole lot of topographic data collected by their farming machinery. They've invested heavily in geophysical analysis of their soil systems, be it EM or radiometric. And also they obviously collect yield maps and have spatial information on nitrogen applications and rainfall across their property. One of the key elements of this was actually all of this data appears and is collected in a non-interoperable manner. The data sets come in and they cannot be combined and compared readily. And the winners of this competition, I'll just give you a couple, basically one of the key things they did was to set up compatible data systems. So the data could be used, compared and mined and illustrated very readily in really effectively like apps for the company. So 2 teams, this one came third, this one came first. This is Roger Laws. Basically taking spatial map, provided an app, this is a screenshot of an app, taking yield maps, being able to convert those into gross margin maps, and then being able to create, for example, tools where the company can modulate the price of grain, the price of fertiliser, and analyse that spatially across any of the paddocks that they wish to make decisions about in terms of, say, variable rate or some kind of spatially managed program. Ross Searle's team here, which included CSIRO and BCG. The second team, by the way, was from Sydney University. I'm not going to show their data, not because it's absolutely excellent, but it's their analysis, so I'll leave that to them. Came up with something very similar to what Roger's team had developed, but also added modelling and predictive systems for the company, so they could then, for example, analyse variable yields across their paddocks from differential rainfall patterns, in addition to some of the input management systems that were going on here. The key here is it's all very spatially resolved and also allows for very precise spatial management. So that's just a taste of what can be done now, and I think we will see more of this in the future. The whole area is moving towards individual plant prescriptions, which of course is a challenge for a grains property, but this is making very rapid progress in horticulture. So for trees, this is an almond plantation, for example, where you can use thermography to look at water status of plants, or hyperspec to look at nutritional status, and then you can go in, at least into these systems, and make very specific interventions. Ultimately, in the future, this is going to get scaled down into equipment on farming machinery that will be very, very nimble in making applications at a very, very high level of resolution on farms. Now, it's not very interesting watching plants grow under digital systems, but I know a lot of you are involved in mixed farming. This is an example of a digital technology for managing livestock. These cattle have essentially a collar, or you can get an ear tag, which has a GPS system in it, radio connectivity. So what the producer here has done on an iPad, they've just drawn a line. They don't want those cattle to cross. When the cattle approach it, they get a noise, and if they go too far, they get a mild electric shock, and eventually they learn that the noise is enough. And so they won't cross this line. And you can use this as a herding and management tool for managing livestock. It's just a neat video example of what can be done with these types of sensor and digital technologies. And ultimately, it can be used for herding and selective grazing. The value chain, basically, this is the value chain that you're working in. This is basically becoming much more digitised, and nowadays, basically, consumers can actually connect directly to producers. Producers can connect directly to consumers through digital technology, and there's a process known as disintermediation, which is where this connectivity can start to remove people from the middle of the chain. Classic example would be, for example, this week when we've got the visit of the CEO of Alibaba. It's very likely that Alibaba, as well as Amazon, are actually going to enter the food business. And so who's going to lose out when you can actually access food purchases through an online system very, very, very readily? Someone in the middle here is going to lose part of their market share. And we can base this connectivity between consumers and farmers means that consumers should be able to understand more how their food is produced, where it came from. This is going to change the way that actually the market operates. So that's enough on digital agriculture. I'm just going to talk very briefly about emerging breeding technologies. Excuse me. This is just an illustration of the relative size of genomes. the DNA in a plant. Wheat is the major crop here in Australia, a grain crop. It has a massive genome, much bigger than barley, here expressed here as Jupiter, and rice here as Neptune, and Arabidopsis as Earth. And that's because it's got a very complex polyploid genome with lots of chromosomes. Again, an example of digital technology and smart analytics. The wheat genome was being sequenced chromosome by chromosome in a very sort of methodical way, but it was very slow. But this Israeli company, NRGene, came along and has developed a system that can automatically assemble a wheat gene reference. And it's basically brought the sequencing of the wheat genome forward by 4 years, effectively, to get the reference. And this means that the use of the genome in breeding will become much more readily used. And data collection in breeding, breeders traditionally, of course, walk through their rows, make decisions about what selections they're going to make on visual inspection. That'll probably still happen, or with manual measurements. But new technologies really are using sensor technologies loaded on helicopters or drones, or on multiple visualization technologies loaded onto things like this as a buggy that can be pushed over a paddock very readily to capture a very detailed image about crop canopies from which selections can be made with much more precision and non-invasively, and also from the comfort maybe of your desk. So that's going to change, I think, the rate of progress in breeding and the extent of progress. Those two application of genome selections and phenome selections. But coming back to health, I thought one of the key things is actually, are we going to remain a commodity exporter, or are we going to become a mosaic of higher value food product exporters? We have a pipeline in CSIRO of modified grains for human health attributes. Some of them you'll be familiar with, for example, Barley Max. It's been around for a while. Last year we released gluten-free barley, which has been commercialised as a beer and is now moving into a food market in Australia. High amylose wheat will be coming soon. That's from the Lima Grain, GRDC, CSIRO joint venture. And I thought that there's another one that's coming along the lines. I thought I'd just give you a taste of that. Thick allurone cereals. This is a classical cereal grain, the starchy endosperm, and then the cell layer around that, the allurone, is where all the goodness lies, effectively, in a grain. And we've been working with the Chinese Academy of Sciences to identify grains that have thick allurone. So this is a rice grain, single cell layer allurone, and we've identified lines that have 7 to 10 cell layer thick allurone layers. And if you do a nutrient analysis of those, then there are massive increases in most of the essential nutrients. Now, the issue about rice, of course, it's easy to work on, but all of the allurone gets polished off when you make white rice. So this is wholemeal rice, and I don't buy wholemeal rice, and I don't think people will use it very much. But exactly the same technology can be applied to wheat, and that's really one of the end games that we're working on at the moment in terms of a novel, healthy cereal. This is not genetically modified. This is using essentially traditional breeding technologies, and we're very confident that that can be applied to wheat. I will move on to genetic modification now. I love coming to South Australia to talk about genetic modification. And I'll mention also gene editing. There are still some good programs of work in Australia on the applications of genetic modification in agriculture. This is just some examples. CSIRO involved in most of these. Broad spectrum disease resistance, novel oils, I'll talk about that in a minute, bit more detail. Here in Adelaide, basically fixing heterosis, fixing hybrid vigour in crops so it can self and just produce the benefits of hybrid vigour. That's Anna Coltnell using that. That's funded by Bill and Melinda Gates. Boosting photosynthesis, again, programs funded by Bill and Melinda Gates. Pesticide-resistant legumes, and nitrogen-fixing plants. There's been some fantastic progress made in this because now we can now express many more genes in plants simultaneously than we had previously. Just run through a few examples. This is one that will be coming in the foreseeable future. Basically, canola, where the oil has significant content of omega-3 fatty acids. Again, a health attribute built into a grain. It's a product of a joint venture, a partnership between CSIRO, New Seed and GRDC. And this is just an anecdote really about what this could replace in terms of omega-3 oils, which are currently obtained through the fish harvest. There's another technology from our oils group which is has huge potential, and this is actually creating plants that accumulate very high contents of oil in their leaves. We've been able to generate plants that accumulate close to 40% of the dry weight of the leaf as oil. And here, if you look at sections of these cells, you can see these are the starch granules that are quite common in leaf cells. But this stuff in the middle, this is actually oil droplets. And if you do the calculations on this, you can actually get oil yields, theoretically, because we're only just about to start to do field trials, but theoretically, you can get oil yields that will exceed those that are obtained in oil palm, which is by far the highest oil yielding crop. So, not quite sure how this is going to go, but it could potentially be a very disruptive technology around oil production systems, not only in Australia, but globally. And how are we going for time here? Sorry? Okay, I might just skip past that one in that case. Genetic modification has always been controversial, and we know that it's subject to very strong regulation and very strong assessment. There's a new technology called gene editing, which has much more precision. One of the I suppose disadvantages of genetic modification is we don't control where the foreign genes land in the genome. Gene editing is a way of actually doing this much more precisely. And we can do very small interventions, so things that are very similar to mutations, single base changes in DNA, as well as anything that larger insertions and deletions. We believe, and certainly in the USA this is the case, that this will be regulated in a different way to genetic modification because the risks are harder to identify, shall we say. Examples of this already being used is to create powdery mildew-resistant wheat, for example. The Chinese group have done this, and this is now being commercially developed by a company in the USA. Basically, this meant putting a single mutation into a specific gene in each of the 3 genomes. So because genetic modification and even gene editing are risky technologies in terms of their delivery to the market, you've got consumer issues, you've got regulatory costs, etc. People are looking for alternative technologies, and this is one example of this is what's known as the biologicals revolution, which is where people are seeking microbes or biological molecules that can be applied to crops that will have some kind of effect on the performance of the crop. It's a little bit more than biological control, which is what we would normally consider to be a biological agent. It's looking for microbes that stimulate particular plant functions. Again, market size looks big, lots of new companies emerging. I could give you an example, and unfortunately not out of the grains industry, but out of the aquaculture industry. Using a bioactive or a biological, if you take any plant matter that's got lignocellulose, which is waste from agriculture, you can put this into a bioreactor, which is basically a pond, which has got a bacterial inoculum that's added to it, and then you can later harvest the material which is generated by that bacterium and add it to aquaculture feed. And this gives you a very rapid stimulation in growth of prawns, of 40%. This is commercialised in Australia, and it's commercialised now in Southeast Asia. It's an example of where just addition of a microbial agent has actually resulted in stimulation of what you're trying to produce. And that's the basis of what people are trying to develop. There are other interventions along this line. Monsanto are well aware that glyphosate resistance in weeds is a big problem. It's a big problem in the US, and we know it's a problem here. Often the reason that glyphosate resistance occurs is because the target protein for the herbicide is produced at much higher amounts in the resistant weeds. And so they've developed a spray which can suppress the expression of the target protein's gene, so you end up with a lower amount, and then the plant becomes susceptible again to the herbicide. It's called BioDirect. It's still in development, and there are trials here with some herbicide-resistant weeds sprayed with Roundup, and here sprayed with Roundup plus the BioDirect technology. And finally, in terms of novel interventions, there's a lot of new materials being developed for applications in agriculture. This is one that's been developed in CSIRO, and currently we're trying to put this into a commercialisation pipeline. It's a biodegradable polymer which you spray on the ground. It prevents evapotranspiration out of the soil. It degrades over the season. And in some trials that we've undertaken in the horticulture industry and one here with sorghum, you get 22 to 34% increases in water productivity in these trials, and there are much bigger trials being undertaken at the moment. How are we going? That's nearly it, okay. This section, I'll just give you a 30-second on this. This section, I won't go into it in detail. It's some bioeconomic modelling that we've undertaken in CSIRO. It's published in Nature last year, where we're looking at future climate mitigation strategies and how that might impact on Australian agriculture. And what it's about is what happens if we start getting a price for carbon that then alters decision-making on farm about what you're going to grow on your farm. And future scenarios where you've got weak mitigation, like we have at the moment, mild, very strong and strong. You can see here there's a change here from livestock production with this colour as you move through carbon pricing increases. You don't need too much, just over $30 a tonne, to where the prediction would be that we would start see massive changes in land use on farm where carbon plantings start replacing other uses, for example, such as livestock production in less arable land. Final slide, and my conclusion is that obviously this is about what's coming. Some of this is coming in the short term, such as those digital technologies. Some of this is coming in the much longer term, such as some of those GM technologies. But to actually get this to your clients, if you're a consultant, or you as a grower, if you're a grower, we need to have a system which actually takes research products to market in this country. Generally speaking, Australia scores very poorly in its ranking on what they call the Innovation Efficiency Index. The efficiency index means how much you spend on R&D and how much benefit you get from it in the economy. And we're down here in 2014, we were 81st. 2016, we were 73rd. And there's a whole bunch of countries that we would consider ourselves competitive with that are way above us and moving in the other direction. And I think it's critical that organisations like CSIRO, as a government research agency that works closely with industry, GRDC, which is an industry-led agency but also receives government funding, work together to actually put in place these mechanisms of getting these products to the people that need them and want to use them. So thank you.